Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. Dissect and Connect is a service of New River Valley Community Services and the Montgomery County Prevention Partners. If you happen to be a regular listener of this podcast, you may have noticed from the graphics used to promote this particular episode that we're going to mix things up a bit today. I have the pleasure of welcoming two guests to the show, Scott and Jennifer Bertollo with the Virginia Tech Autism Clinic and Center for Autism Research, which you may hear us refer to as VTAC throughout our conversation. Jen Scott is the Rural Outreach and Grants Coordinator for VTAC. She has worked closely over the years with development of the Mobile Autism Clinic, a program that you'll be hearing more about during our interview. She also provides support that is tied to research projects conducted by the center's graduate students from the psychology department, maintains and trains student clinicians on the use of the mobile unit, connects with community partners, and assists with grants, contracts, and advancement. Jen is a proud graduate of Virginia Tech and received her Master of Public Health from Tulane University. Jennifer Bertollo is a doctoral student in the clinical psychology program at Virginia Tech. Jennifer graduated from Binghamton University, where she studied psychology with a focus on applied behavior analysis and worked as an aide for children with autism spectrum disorder. She then worked for several years at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Center for Autism Research before moving to Blacksburg. So, Jen and Jennifer, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. We're so glad to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. We're glad to be here.
So most of us have heard the term autism, but not everyone truly understands what that means. Could you give our listeners who may have limited knowledge around the subject a general overview of what autism is?
Sure. So autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's really characterized by kind of two broader areas of difficulty or behavior. So first, we're looking at difficulties in things like social interaction and communication. So while each individual's presentation of autism can look pretty different, a lot of the things that we tend to see are difficulties with back and forth conversations, difficulties with maybe turn taking or perspective taking, difficulties with communicating about our own emotions, or maybe the ability to kind of understand or read other individuals' emotions. Things like fostering age-appropriate friendships and relationships, other nonverbal communication difficulties, so things like eye contact, facial expressions, gesture use can often be really big areas of difficulty as well. The second area is the presence of what we call restricted repetitive behaviors and interests. So a lot of things can fall into this domain, but a lot of times we see things like really restricted interests. So maybe becoming really fixated on certain topics or certain activities of interest, sometimes really repetitive behaviors. So either repetitive motor movements or repetitive use of certain objects or phrases, as well as things like difficulties with change and transition. So these could be transitions that might feel really kind of minor in day to day. So just kind of going from, home to school and back, but also things like going from middle school to high school to college, or living independently. Some of those more major transitions can be especially difficult. And the last thing we tend to see a lot of here are sensory difficulties. So sensory seeking behaviors, but also things like sensory sensitivity. So being really kind of overwhelmed by just really daily sensory input.
Has there been any definitive research to show what causes autism?
I'll take this one as well. So the short answer to that question is that there really is no short answer. So while a lot of research has been conducted and continues to be conducted to really better address this question, the best understanding currently is that autism spectrum disorder is likely impacted by a combination of factors, so genetic factors, environmental factors, and other more kind of molecular, cellular level factors. And so a more accurate way of thinking about it, rather than maybe causes per se, is more like risk factors. So for one thing, in terms of the heritability of autism, we know that there is a fairly high heritability. So for example, if one parent or one child in a family has ASD, the chances of another sibling or child also having ASD are a lot higher than in the general population. Another way they look at this in research is through twin studies. So looking at identical twins who share all of the same genes versus a fraternal twin who shares more like a regular parent or sibling. And so what they do find is that if one twin has autism, chances of the second twin having autism are a lot higher in identical twin sets than fraternal twins or non-identical twins. So what that tells us is there is kind of that degree of genetic loading there, but that doesn't tell us nearly the majority of the variability or the risk factor. So some other risk factors might include things like exposure to certain chemicals or toxins, particularly during really critical periods of development. So things like thalidomide or valproic acid during the prenatal period, for example. Other things that have been looked at in terms of a wealth of kind of neuroscience work, which I will note is not my wheelhouse, is certainly underway. And they look at a lot of, not necessarily causes, although that as well, but a lot of risk factor, biomarkers that can really be telling in terms of identifying autism or some of those difficulties from pretty early on in development. So things like differences in brain size or rate of brain growth during certain periods, things like differences in the function or structure of the brain. And then some other factors that, again, might serve as additional risk factors might include things like the proximity of time in between multiple pregnancies for a mother or the age of a father at conception. So again, no one of these factors being causal in and of itself, but really just evidence to suggest that for some individuals, these kind of combinations of factors might increase their overall risk.
So how early can someone be diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, I'll take that one. This is Jen Scott. And ASD can sometimes be detected as early as 18 months or younger, but by age 2, a diagnosis by an experienced professional can be considered very reliable. A lot of children, unfortunately, don't get diagnosed until older. So with a diagnosis, they do need a trained specialist, such as a developmental pediatrician or a child psychologist, and they will look at the developmental history and behavior of that child and make a diagnosis. And this is all done through questionnaires to the parents, activities done with the child, and observation. And then the results of this formal evaluation will determine whether that child needs specific treatments. And then the parents can access those services for their child through schools or community services boards, early intervention, and things like that. There's also what's called a screening tool, and sometimes at well child visits or pediatric offices, the child will be screened by that medical professional, and it's just a quick 20-minute questionnaire to the parents. And so that tool can tell the parent whether that child might be on the right developmental track or not. And if not, depending on the area of concern, they might be recommended to go get a diagnostic assessment. So those have proven to be helpful as well.
Does the diagnosis tend to happen after a child, in not all cases obviously, but in some cases does it happen after the child enrolls in school?
I think in some cases first, once they're enrolled in school, and I also think with the families that we've been working with as they get older and their behavior kind of gets difficult to manage, then the parents really realize they need to reach out. And Jen might have some more to add to this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that so when we're looking at autism, we're looking for these difficulties to be present from really early on, as Jen's indicated, really prior to 3 years of age, but often much earlier. But a lot of times we don't see the difficulties fully manifest until the social demands of daily life really exceed what their capacity is. So we might see a kiddo who at a young age is showing some difficulties, but it's not as, as profound as you might kind of expect or really immediately be alarmed about. But then to your point, Mike, as you get into school age and those social demands become really different, or as Jen's indicated, for some individuals as they get into kind of older childhood years, so maybe we're getting into middle school and all of a sudden those really unique social demands are really exceeding our capacity. And so for some individuals, even though difficulties are early from really present, we don't see them at their full, in their full form until a bit later.
So how prevalent is autism in the United States?
So autism these days can affect 1 in 54 children, and it is the fastest growing neurodevelopmental disorder. And boys are 4 times as more likely to be diagnosed as girls.
Wow. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions about people with autism?
Yeah, Yeah, so I think there are a lot of misconceptions that would be worth discussing. In the interest of time, I'll focus, I think, on the ways in which the behavior of individuals with autism, I think, is often misunderstood or misconstrued. I'll focus a lot on children, but a lot of these points really generalize through adulthood. But we assess and provide intervention for a lot of children who, especially prior to receiving a diagnosis, or if living in a community maybe where autism isn't as well understood, are often labeled as being really oppositional, as being really defiant, really aggressive, or otherwise just difficult in their behavior. And I feel like a lot of these labels really imply this level of intentionality behind, especially the negative behaviors. And so, as I mentioned at the start, major difficulties for individuals with autism can include things like transitions and change, becoming really overwhelmed by really daily sensory input. So things that might not seem really out of the ordinary to someone who's not impacted by these difficulties. So something really mundane can be really overwhelming. And so if you can imagine just being really overwhelmed by a seemingly minor change in your day or a sound that's maybe not bothering the people around you, and then not having a great way to communicate that to somebody for help, or not having many great ways to kind of express and regulate that emotional experience yourself, this often culminates in these outbursts or meltdowns, or other negative behavior that can sometimes include things like aggression or negative verbalizations. And so we talk a lot about behaviors being kind of like icebergs. So when you look at an iceberg, you just see the tip of the iceberg. You don't see the whole glacier underneath the iceberg. And so if we're considering challenging behaviors in children or adults with autism, it's really similar. So we might, as a family member, a community member, a teacher, a provider, we might look at that child and we just see the tantrum or the outburst. And what we don't see is kind of what's underlying that behavior and what is really kind of making things so difficult that that behavior or that response is coming out. So I am really quite a big fan of the way that Dr. Lauren Kenworthy describes this. She's up at Children's National Medical Center, and she discusses this idea that what looks like won't is often can't. And I think that that shift of lens is really, really helpful. So if we're kind of taking these seemingly negative behaviors and saying, they won't listen to me, they're being so selfish right now, why won't they just stop that? If you're overwhelmed and you really can't get a handle on those behaviors, then that's a really poor understanding of where those behaviors are coming from. So I think when we can shift that lens and focus on understanding what's difficult for that person rather than focusing on the negative aspects of the behavior, we change the story a lot from, why are you acting like this? Why won't you stop? To one of what's making this difficult for you and how can I support you? And I think that that's a really helpful change of frame.
Tell me about the work that's being done at the VTAC CAR.
So the Autism Clinic was established in 2005 by Dr. Angela Scarpa, and it serves as a training clinic for the doctoral students in the psychology department in that clinical science program. And Dr. Scarpa supervises those students who then go and conduct diagnostic assessments, interventions, consultations, and research. And so families and individuals, some who come as far away as the DC area or maybe even out of state, who come drive to our clinic, they can receive an assessment or intervention services at the clinic. Then we also have the Center for Autism Research, which we work very closely with. And the center focuses on research that merges multiple disciplines. And we work with over 40 faculty affiliates across campus and within the community. And together, the two, the center and the clinic, work together to merge science with service. So over the years, providing services at the stationary clinic in Blacksburg, Dr. Scarpa began to understand that for our nearby rural communities, the geographic distance to autism services or the limited specialty providers available in those localities and or the high cost of services for autism-specific treatment can make it more difficult for those families to access the needed evidence-based services. And so Dr. Scarpa in 2017 was awarded a grant that allowed her to purchase a used RV and have that renovated into what we now refer to as our Mobile Autism Clinic, or the MAC for another acronym. And the MAC was officially launched in 2018. And the clinical science students who are receiving their training drive the MAC down into further Southwest Virginia, and we have partnered over the years with Mount Rogers Community Services. And so those student clinicians drive down and offer either treatment or evaluations to families at low cost or no cost. And up until the pandemic ceased all in-person operations in March, the MAC had traveled over 7,600 miles and served over 25 families, which was really wonderful. And we are very, very excited to have the MAC and hopefully get it open soon as we can. But since March, the clinic has made quite a shift to telehealth services. And I'm going to let Jen Bertollo talk about that.
Thanks. So as a doctoral student here in the clinical science program, I can also speak just a little bit to kind of what training opportunities the Autism Clinic and Center for Autism Research offer for future clinicians and researchers, which, as Jen has alluded to, that we've been able to have the opportunity to serve as the clinicians who take the Mobile Autism Clinic out on the road. And so to actually be able to be interfacing with families in their home communities has been really important for me personally. To be able to really immerse myself in the kind of culture and surroundings of the families here in rural Appalachia, to really understand kind of what their experience is, I think allows us to serve families in a really different way than them just coming into our clinic, where we kind of see them in the absence of all of these different contextual and family and community factors. So really being able to provide that as a clinical service and a clinical training opportunity. But what we also kind of offer here is a research opportunity, as Jen's alluded to. So we want to make sure, especially as we're conducting clinical services, that we're using really the best evidence-based, really grounded in good research. And so for us to be able to have the opportunity to really study the services we're providing is really important from a community standpoint and from a research standpoint. And so I've had the opportunity to be able to conduct my master's thesis actually through the Mobile Autism Clinic, which I'm wrapping up currently. And so prior to that, there was intervention being done through the mobile clinic, but Dr. Scarpa and Jen and other students had thought a lot about the option of changing to assessment services, since that's something that families in the community indicated feeling like there was a relative shortage of in their area. So we began going out last summer to conduct these assessment services on the mobile clinic. And through my thesis, we were studying the feasibility, so piloting how well does this assessment method work for families? Are we able to reach families? Is this comfortable and satisfactory for them? And also to supply them with additional autism education for the parents after a diagnosis, which seems to be really important, particularly in an area where autism information isn't as readily available. So as Jen noted, obviously, the COVID pandemic would have it that we could not continue to take the MAC out anymore following March or so. And so we spent the spring really working on coming up with an assessment battery that we could administer safely online with families through telehealth. And so since probably May, for the past 3 or 4 months, we've been conducting sessions safely through live video platforms while families are actually just in the comfort of their own home, which has been really exciting because not only have we been able to continue to make their services accessible during a pandemic, which is largely unprecedented in our community, but we've been able to do a couple of things. We've been able to get additional family context, I think. So I mentioned before having this option to really see families in their community. Now we're seeing them in their home, which they have been so gracious. They've really been the stars here, kind of letting us into their home, facilitating these assessments. But I think we're able to understand just factors that impact a child in a family that we wouldn't otherwise get to see. But it also means that, once this pandemic has come and gone, there are still barriers to reaching services. That's why we have the mobile clinic, is that we're trying to bring services closer to families who maybe can't get to our center. But at the end of the day, we can't always get to everybody either, depending on how far away they are. And so to have this telehealth method that we're feeling really confident in administering that really breaks down those barriers, we could see a family on the other side of the state that there's no way they could drive to our clinic and back in the course of a day. So really being able to have this method of service delivery that we feel confident in for future use to continue to break down barriers to accessing care when it's not geographically available, I think has been really important.
It's encouraging for me to hear that the families that you've interacted with through the mobile clinic have been receptive and welcoming. I think traditionally with the culture of this region, folks are a little more guarded about people they deem to be outsiders, for lack of a better term. So it's really nice to hear that you've been so well received.
Yeah, I think we owe a lot of how well this has gone really to families being so trusting and willing to let us in. I think, it can be really easy to say, you're the clinician, you're the researcher from the university, from the hospital. There's that kind of ivory tower view that I think can be genuinely really, really intimidating. You want to make sure that you're receiving services that really have your child's best interest in mind. And I know the scare of kind of divulging that for research purposes can seem like a scary thing. And I think a nice thing about what we're able to do is we're clearly stepping down on the ground level, driving a clinic out on wheels into their community. I think, at face value, it kind of looks different then. I'm not willing to leave my university, to leave my lab. You'll just come here and participate despite any barriers you have. So I think when the first thing that we're really addressing is how do we make this more accessible to you, I think it speaks a really different picture. Even though we are not located, in the same exact area as a lot of the families we serve, we are here in Blacksburg. And so we are in a largely rural area. We are among the Appalachian region. And so a lot of our discussions as a research lab, as a clinic, as a course requirement, we're talking a lot about kind of the diversity of families we serve. And so a big focus for us is focusing on this region where resources might be lower, where education about mental health services or healthcare more broadly might be a little bit lower. And so being able to really understand what those resources look like and what that knowledge base might look like, and how those may or may not interact with the cultural, religious, et cetera, views of the area. And I think being able to really delicately have those conversations in a way that really respects the culture and the background of our families while really educating them and providing them with this knowledge that's going to be really powerful for advocating for services for their child is something we've been able to do really well in collaboration with these families.
Both of you mentioned the pandemic. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how COVID-19 might adversely impact individuals with autism.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think the difficulties with transition and change really come out here. So I think for everybody, this has been a really unprecedented time. It's been this time of everything you know about daily life just got turned upside down in a lot of ways. Relatively few people are kind of going about their normal daily schedule, going to work on their normal hours with the same resources available to them. Some of the, best regulated, most flexible people I know are having a hard time with this because most people are at this point, to feel like the things that you're normally able to access that kind of lead to really positive functioning and mental health aren't really available in the same way. And so if you consider you're somebody who has a really big difficulty with transitions as it is, you really thrive off of routine, you maybe are really anxious and have a hard time expressing that and seeking help with that. And now all of a sudden, all of that structure is gone. So every day, for a lot of people, every day feels the same. Is it Monday? Is it Thursday? Is it 9 a.m.? Is it 2 p.m.? Does it make a difference what day or time it is? Because these structures aren't really in place the way they are during a work or a school year. For a lot of individuals with ASD, weekends or summer breaks can be really dysregulating, even though you or I might kind of have this mindset of school or work is out, we get a little bit of a break here. There's something about that structure and that predictability that a lot of individuals, particularly individuals with ASD, can really thrive from. And so when all of a sudden that predictable routine is gone, anxiety and fear are heightened left and right, it really puts them in a uniquely difficult place to cope with all of this. And now we all of a sudden see the general population reacting to a lack of structure in a way that individuals with ASD are really familiar with. And so for them, it's, often much more difficult now. I think also just kind of the closures that have resulted from COVID. So when we consider the services and the businesses, the services that can't function in person currently that have had to be closed due to the pandemic, some for many, many months now. Individuals with autism often have, great behavioral health needs, often have added mental health needs relative to the general population. sometimes have, greater, medical health needs or more unique health needs. And so when you're considering these service closures where people aren't able to get in for appointments or services that they really need, that's going to just duly impact individuals with ASD, perhaps who maybe have greater service needs, and now these services are unavailable. And I think also in terms of things like autism assessment, the wait lists for autism assessments are very long typically. And so often families can be on a wait list depending on their area and the providers available. It could take well over a year for a lot of families to be diagnosed. And so if you're sitting on a wait list and you're almost there and then pandemic strikes and that clinic closes and you now aren't able to get that evaluation and the services that you're going to get from a diagnosis now for who's to say how long, indefinitely, as long as businesses aren't able to open up safely. And so if you're not in the luxurious position of having a clinic that's been able to use their resources to make the shift to teleassessment, or you're a family for whom teleassessment isn't accessible, then you're kind of having this added wait time to get in contact and have access to services that could really make a big difference for your child and family.
Are there any medications or other therapies that have been proven to be effective in helping people with autism?
That's a really good question. So I'll start with the medication question. And the short answer to the question is that no, there is no medication for the core symptoms of autism, which is maybe not surprising that there wouldn't be a medication to treat, say, social skills or communication skills. However, that is kind of a common misconception, would be that there is a medication for treating autism. What we do see, though, is many individuals with autism have other co-occurring difficulties or other co-occurring diagnoses. So they might have autism with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or they might have autism and really severe anxiety. And so medications that might be used to treat symptoms of ADHD or symptoms of anxiety can still be used by individuals with autism. So often we'll see a lot of those co-occurring difficulties being handled through medication management, but not the core symptoms of autism.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and in terms of therapy, yes, there are a number of evidence-based practices that have been shown to be really effective for individuals with autism. I'm obviously not going to go through an extensive list of them right now, but typically a lot of the most effective interventions, and especially the ones that we're recommending from a really young age, are rooted in ABA, or applied behavior analysis. So those are going to be interventions that really focus on understanding the context and the trigger for certain behaviors, perhaps instances that make certain behaviors more likely to occur, and then the consequences that maybe are reinforcing those behavior. So really, what is the function of that behavior we're seeing? And if we really understand the function of that behavior, or different consequences or environments that maybe make the behavior more or less likely, then we can use that knowledge to, increase positive or helpful behaviors, or decrease or replace behaviors that are maybe not as helpful, or in some cases could even be, harmful or negative for a child or adult. And so a lot of these interventions can kind of take on different tactics from applied behavior analysis or other cognitive behavioral type therapies. And so a big type of therapy that we often recommend for a lot of individuals we work with include social skills interventions, such as social skills groups. And those can be a really nice, safe environment for individuals with autism to learn some of those social skills that might come a little bit more naturally to their peers, and practice them with other individuals who are also struggling with those difficulties. So get really great practice using these social skills, making and maintaining friendships, things that are really going to translate to real life. And even from a really young age, things like language acquisition interventions, things like pivotal response training, for example, which really capitalizes on those triggers and consequences to encourage young children who are behind in their language acquisition to use words verbally. So to really praise them by gaining access to the things that they're now able to speak or request are really, really effective. And in general, just in terms of kind of differentiating different therapies that can be really helpful for parents, particularly when resources are limited and we need to be really mindful about where we're allocating our family's limited resources. We really recommend interventions that are more naturalistic and developmental. And so what that means is that these are interventions that are often taking place in the home, in the community, at school. So a child or adult is able to learn these skills in the environment where they actually live all day, rather than just at the clinic or the doctor's office, where if they're lucky, they might get to spend 30 minutes to an hour a week. So that really allows for these skills to generalize to their real world settings. And that's also really important when we're taking into account the role that parents or family members can play in intervention. So we really are big proponents of parent-mediated interventions, where parents can actually be trained to be the therapist or to aid the therapist in making learning and training opportunities for their child throughout the day. Since parents are often with their children, hours and hours a day, 7 days a week. And that's very different from how much time they're going to have face-to-face access to a clinician or a therapist. So it really capitalizes on these high-quality learning opportunities in a way that makes it really generalizable for them.
Do you have any suggested resources for families or listeners who want to learn more about autism?
Yes, there's I think we all know there's so many resources out there, especially at your fingertips. But I will give you a couple of websites and then a book that I found helpful, and Jen might have some more to add to it. So you can always access our website, the VTAC website, and I'll give a little more information about that in a few minutes to learn more about our services and our research. And we also have the Psychological Services Center here on campus and the Child Studies Center here on campus. And they have great websites as well and a variety of services for families to access. We often partner with CA Human Services out of Richmond, and on their website, they offer different educational webinars and trainings. Sometimes they're free, and they also offer a variety of services. So that is a great website to check out. Again, it's CA Human Services. And then there's the Virginia Autism Council, and they provide a clearinghouse of a variety of information. So I definitely recommend families checking out the Virginia Autism Council. And then for national organizations, there's the Autism Society and Autism Speaks, and they provide a lot of advocacy and education, information, referrals, support. So those websites can be very helpful. Then there's also the Organization for Autism Research, or OAR, and it's a parent-led organization. It's grounded in science and offers information and resources for those with ASD who might be looking for jobs or who may live in military families, and they also provide a lot of safety information for families. One book that I found really helpful, because I came to this without any knowledge of autism, so I'm learning as I go, and the Overcoming Autism, Finding Answers and Strategies and Hope That Can Transform a Child's Life by Lynn Kern-Cagle and Claire Lezebnik. I found those just really great hands-on interventions and examples that families might find really helpful. And Jen has a very different experience than I do, and she is very knowledgeable, so if she has anything else to add, she's welcome to.
No, I think you really hit the nail on the head with a lot of those resources. I think the resources that really make autism knowledge accessible to families and communities are really important. I was going to say Autism Speaks. They have a lot of really great resources through their website in terms of disseminating information, but also tools like, what types of autism services is my insurance plan required to cover, things that are just not really common knowledge that I think they've done a really great job at making accessible through really family-friendly tools. Another website that I really like is Spectrum News. They are set up in a very blog-like format in terms of the way that a lot of their information reads, and so they do a really great job of really talking with researchers and professionals and then making that information digestible and disseminated to communities and families. That I think is really helpful, because it's not the intimidating 40-page long research study paper out there that maybe isn't really, digestible by the general public, and takes it and really puts it into what are the real takeaways from this and what does this mean for us as a general population that's not high up in their ivory tower research office. And so I think, the fact that they really make this effort to disseminate that information that otherwise is likely to just not be spread throughout the population quite as readily.
If you would both be so kind as to forward those links to me, I'll be sure to include those in our show notes for today's episode.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So how can our listeners get in touch with the VT CAR and find out more about what you do?
So you can always search for our website, Virginia Tech Autism Clinic or VT CAR. We have a lot of information about our services and other resources that you can access. And the phone number here that you can call is 540-231-2053. And you can leave a message and someone will return your call and answer your questions. Or you can email the VT Autism Center at vt.edu. If you're seeking diagnostic assessments here in Blacksburg, again, I mentioned earlier, we have the Child Study Center here on campus, and they are assessing children 18 months through 16 years. And so their phone number is 540-231-8276. And then our Psychological Services Center can assess adolescents and adults age 17 or older. And that number is 540-231-6914. And we all work together to make all of this happen.
Thank you for that. Well, this episode has been packed with information. Before I let you go, though, I have to put you on the spot and ask you for parting words of wisdom to share with our listeners. So who wants to go first?
I can take it. So I think one key thing is if you do have any concerns about your child's development, just to start asking questions and seek any guidance that you can find. Reach out to your pediatrician, your family medical professional, your community services board, early intervention services, your school system, even university clinics like ours. Call, ask questions, and see what is available and what kind of services you can access. The earlier you can get your child diagnosed, the better the outcomes will be long-term, and the more advantages you will have as far as access to services for your child, especially as they enter school for the first time. They can already be set up with any additional accommodations they might need. So those would be my words of wisdom. The earlier the diagnosis, the better off for everyone.
Duly noted. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, Jen. And I just want to echo in terms of the seeking information. Knowledge is really power here, both for families advocating for services, but also for families and communities trying to understand the experiences of individuals with autism and their families and friends. And so especially in a region like ours where health and mental health resources are limited broadly, what that means is that in particular, autism-related services and autism information might not be as plentiful as it is in other areas nationally. And so really making the effort to learn, to ask, to share, it really does take a village to support an individual with autism in their family. And I think it's really easy for a parent or a family to feel like they have to kind of take that adventure on alone. And there are so many great resources and so many advocates out there. Reach out to your family and friends, share your experience with them. A lot of what I talked about before in terms of misunderstanding behavior, the more that we can educate others around us and advocate for needs and understanding for individuals with ASD, I think goes a really, really long way for the experience that they're going to then meet in school and in the broader community.
Yeah, there's no shame around this. I mean, it's, as you alluded to earlier, it's a very common thing.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I think especially right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. The stress, the overwhelming nature of all of this that you're feeling is very real, especially if you're an individual with autism, perhaps, who's really struggling with this collapse of structure, or you're the family of a child with autism who is now full-time caretaker, teacher, and service provider. That stress is very real. So not being afraid to reach out. And if you have a means of, safely, perhaps having a family member serve as even a babysitter for a couple of minutes so you can just get outside, get some fresh air, and have some you time for 5 minutes, the power of that can be really helpful. I really like the metaphor when you go on an airplane, which I know nobody's done anytime recently, but they always tell you, if you need to put an oxygen mask on, put yours on before you help somebody else with yours, even if they're a small child. Because if you don't put your oxygen mask on, you're not going to have the ability to help them. And so being able to really take care of yourself in this time especially is going to be really important. so that you can be your best self in order to help your child or your family member or friend.
Well, I'm truly grateful for your time and your knowledge and expertise that you've shared with us today, and would love to have you back on the show at some point to maybe do a follow-up. Maybe we'll invite listeners to send in some questions that we could answer as part of a future episode. But again,
that would be great.
Thank you very much for having us. We really appreciate talking and sharing information.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Dissect and Connect is sponsored by Teen Connections, a leadership program through Planned Parenthood South Atlantic that empowers youth with the facts about sexual health and the skills to build stronger, healthier relationships. It's free, totally virtual, and you can earn $100 when you graduate as a Teen Connections peer educator in your community. Join a Teen Connections program from home today. For more information, be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners or New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.